You can sense it even if they don't express it directly to you. The quiet as soon as you enter, the glances that linger a moment too long. They have a smile, but it never reaches their eyes. Didn't you try, made an effort to suit their mold, tried to follow their guidelines, tried to be as understandable as possible? However, despite your efforts to modify yourself, something about you continued to elude them. They were uneasy because they couldn't articulate it. People don't despise what they comprehend. What they cannot control, they despise. You don't share their way of thinking. They move differently than you do. The way they were taught to beg for approval is not how you do it. And that violates the unspoken pact that everyone else is adhering to, the one in which you minimize yourself in order to fit in. You didn't shrink, though. They now perceive your presence as a danger. You were never meant to be like them. There was always something about you that didn't quite fit their expectations, no matter how many times they attempted to force you into it. Perhaps it was the way you questioned things that they took at face value. Perhaps it was the way you held yourself, refusing to change to fit in with others. They could always detect it, even if it was something deeper and beyond your comprehension. They were the first to notice it. The way you didn't just nod along to fit in, the subtle resistance. They initially made an effort to correct you and help you return to what they saw as normal. They advised you to adapt, to become more like everyone else, and to adhere to the predetermined pattern. And perhaps you thought about it for a second. Perhaps you even made an attempt. You wondered whether you were the issue as you observed how they interacted, communicated, and melded into one another so naturally. However, something within you resisted each time you attempted to fit into that mold. It seemed strange, like donning a mask that was too big for your face. You could mimic them, yes. For a while you could play the part, but it was exhausting. It took away something genuine, unadulterated, and essential to your identity. You knew in your heart that if you continued in that manner, you would not only be accepted, but eliminated. The part they'd never grasped was that fitting in meant survival to them. It was security. They constructed their identities around group validation and approval. They were therefore perplexed when they saw you deviating from that, not pleading for permission and not yielding to the same demands. And it's funny how discomfort can follow bewilderment. Uncomfortable becomes judgmental. Furthermore, unrestrained judgment breeds anger, because you weren't the only one who refused. It subtly questioned everything they had decided to become. They didn't want to respond to the questions your presence created. What did it indicate about their need on their approval if you could survive without it? What did it say about the concessions they made in order to maintain acceptance if you could stand by yourself? They began calling you challenging, unique, haughty, and weird as a result. Putting you in a box was simpler than acknowledging that you just didn't fit in. They required those labels because they shielded them, not because they defined you. Labels offered them the comfort of control and the appearance of comprehension. In actuality, though, you never reject their mold out of disobedience for the sake of rebellion. It didn't fit, so you turned it down, because you knew deep down that living under a false name wasn't really living. Through the script, you could see that they were all abiding by the unseen laws that made everyone predictable, controllable, and simple to define. You were unable to unsee it. That's what makes you different. Just awareness, not superiority or disobedience. A realization that you can't return to acting once it takes hold. You gave up attempting to be a version of yourself that appealed to other people. And as a result, you became something that was difficult for them to interpret, manage, or influence. Every time you make a choice without seeking permission, they sense it even though they don't express it verbally. There's something about your gait. For example, you're not waiting for a signal. You're not checking your surroundings to see who is approving, and you're not changing your course to align with theirs. It makes them uneasy. It's not because you talk loudly about it, but rather because you don't. You don't have to make an announcement about your independence. It simply exists, silent and indisputable. The majority of people are taught to consider their surroundings before acting. They assess their decisions against expectations, their actions against responses, and the potential gain or loss of acceptance. Even if it gradually erodes their identity, people have come to trust this system. However, you broke free from that system. You stopped asking the room for advice on how to live your life. You are unpredictable as soon as you did that. People get anxious when things are unpredictable. Their sense of order is disrupted. They are unable to map you out, predict your responses, or classify you into the tidy categories they employ to make sense of the world. Additionally, they cannot control you if they are unable to predict you. That's where the discomfort starts to intensify. It's not really your fault. That's actually what irritates them the most. You're not wreaking havoc. You're not attempting to disturb them. You're just living your life as you see fit. And because your independence reflects back to them in some way, it feels like a subtle threat to everything they've come to accept as normal. It makes them realize how dependent they have been, reliant on approval, affirmation, and conformity to a system they never questioned. It's also not a flattering reflection. It reveals the concessions they've made and the aspects of themselves they've concealed in order to fit in. As a result, others begin to see your independence as conceit. If they can persuade themselves that you believe you are superior to them, it will be simpler. They don't have to face the fact that you might just be more liberated than they are. They turn you into something unfavorable, so they may criticize you and feel justified in their uneasiness. They observe your unhesitating decision-making, and they perceive defiance rather than confidence. They observe someone who is not adhering to the same unseen guidelines. Additionally, the rules themselves appear weaker, less absolute, and less vital when you break them. They're not prepared to accept that. They are unable to avoid the mirror of your freedom. Every time you follow your own route, it serves as a reminder to them that they still have the opportunity to do the same. However, taking that route would require them to confront uncertainty, take a chance on rejection, and abandon the security they have created for themselves. Furthermore, the majority of people would rather hate someone who is free than face their own dread of being free. Therefore, the tension increases because your presence subtly challenges their decisions rather than because you are criticizing them. They begin to distance themselves, judge, condemn, and pull away, not out of strength, but out of discomfort. Because they feel vulnerable when they are around someone who doesn't require the same level of approval. They don't always comprehend it, but they sense it every time they see that you're not waiting for them to tell you who to be. The more you stand alone, the more that uneasiness intensifies. They enjoy explaining, predicting, labeling, and neatly classifying things that give them a sense of control. It makes them feel at ease. This delusion that everything around them has a pattern and that once you know the rules, people are easy. The majority of them dedicate their whole lives to learning these guidelines, committing behaviors to memory and interpreting responses, modifying themselves just enough to be inside acceptable bounds. Gotten really excellent at going along with the system which promotes predictability. Then there's you. They expect you to follow the script, but you don't. You don't respond in the manner they've come to expect. Sometimes you remain silent while they're waiting for a response. Sometimes you say something when they think you won't. They don't always agree with your choices. The tension starts at that point because they lose control the instant they are unable to predict you. Control isn't always apparent. It's not always aggressive or loud. It's usually subtle. It's in how people feel safe when they know how someone would act, how they rely on patterns to navigate relationships, and how they anticipate specific reactions. Everything feels steady when such patterns continue. However, when someone like you deviates from that, the equilibrium they rely on is upset. They begin attempting to decipher you. It's curiosity that they keep a careful eye on you, attempting to decipher your actions and identify a consistent pattern. They ask questions, not always directly, but in the way they observe, in the way they test boundaries, in the way they subtly push to see how you'll respond. They are looking for something they know, something they can identify and classify. However, the more they search, the less they comprehend. At that point, interest starts to give way to unease, because they are powerless over what they cannot comprehend. And they begin to perceive as a problem what they are unable to control. It doesn't fit into the framework they depend on to feel safe, not because it is one. They find it unsettling when you become unpredictable. Not chaotic, not illogical, just beyond what they anticipated. The labels begin to show up at that point. They refer to you as convoluted, inconsistent, and perplexing. They attempt to simplify you and make you easier to handle. But none of the labels really stay. They become more frustrated than they are ready to acknowledge, since you don't act in a way that lets them totally define you. As a result, they stop attempting to understand you and instead try to influence you. Subtle cues, modest pressure, and brief remarks intended to help you return to a more comfortable and predictable situation. It's instinctive, a means of regaining the equilibrium they've lost. Everything will make sense once again if they can make you act like everyone else. However, you don't adapt, at least not in the way they anticipate. The same unpleasant reality is reinforced each time you choose your own response rather than the one they expected. You're not following their guidelines. They find it challenging because of this. You're not hard to deal with. It's because you deny them the authority they are accustomed to. You don't give them predictable responses. You don't shape yourself to fit their expectations. You simply don't fit into the patterns they depend on. You become more difficult to control, influence, and navigate as a result. Additionally, being someone who is difficult to understand becomes something they don't know how to deal with in a society where most people find solace in control. They get uncomfortable just by the fact that you take your time filling the void. The majority of individuals are afraid of silence. They handle it as if it were a hole that needs to be filled, something uncomfortable that needs to be covered up with words, sounds, and responses. However, you allowed it to remain there. You give it room to breathe, and something about you becomes more difficult to read and understand in that silence. They anticipate prompt, familiar reactions, such as a chuckle at the appropriate time, a joke to keep things going, or a response that reassures them that everything is normal. It's how they verify control, gauge connection, and maintain consistency in interactions. However, it throws them off balance when you don't react as they anticipate, when you hesitate rather than react, or when you watch rather than take part. Your quiet isn't meaningless. However, it seems that was what they don't see the awareness, the reasoning behind it, or the way you process information before determining what merits a response. They only notice the lack of what they are accustomed to, and since it allows room for uncertainty, that absence unnerves people. The majority of individuals steer clear of uncertainty. They start to doubt themselves as a result. They start to wonder what you're thinking, what you've observed, and what you decided to keep quiet. And that's where the discomfort begins to intensify, because people begin to fill in the blanks on their own when they are unable to read you. They interpret your silence as condemnation. They believe you are dissecting them, dissecting their statements, and seeing through things they would prefer to keep private. Sometimes they interpret your silence as a sign of disfavor. It doesn't matter what you're actually doing, even if you haven't spoken anything to imply it. It's about what their minds can conjure up when you remain silent. People are accustomed to communicating in order to be understood. What they say, how they respond, and how they interact all show who they are. It is a system of continuous signals that are continuously timers talk. And when to signals is to symbol, you refrain, you decide when to talk and when not to. Additionally, This is slightly They are agitated by the distance. They begin attempting to extract something from you. Anything that lets them know they can still understand your response, a confirmation, anything. In an effort to break through the silence, they can offer questions they wouldn't typically ask, push harder, and talk more. However, the more they press, the more noticeable your silence becomes. At that point, things change. Curiosity gives way to discomfort, which gradually transforms into annoyance. They start to perceive your silence as an issue rather than a decision, something that interferes with the organic flow they depend on and leaves them feeling vulnerable for no apparent reason. Because they are unable to readily manage what your silence does, they are forced to sit alone since there is no steady sound to hide behind and no dependable responses to rely on. They are forced to confront their own ideas, fears, and need for approval. Most individuals find it uncomfortable to stay there. They reroute that discomfort rather than facing it. They describe you as chilly, aloof, and indifferent. They portray your quiet as a weakness, something bad, something that has to be corrected. It's simpler to assign you a title than to wonder why your unassuming presence has such a profound impact on people. In actuality, though, your quiet is not a sign of weakness. Control is what it is. It's consciousness. It's the capacity to decide when to participate and when to just watch. Additionally, a person who is totally at peace in silence becomes something they don't know how to deal with in a society where most people speak only to avoid feeling uncomfortable. Everyone abides by certain rules that are not written down. You can sense them in how individuals act, how they modify themselves according on who is seeing, and how they have an innate sense of what is and isn't appropriate. Nobody sits you down and goes over these guidelines with you. It is expected of you to take them in, assimilate them, and join the pattern without ever questioning it. When it's expected, smile. When it's simpler, agree. Avoid being overly noticeable. Avoid saying things that cause discomfort to others. Stay within the bounds of what is deemed normal. It's a covert control mechanism based on nuanced expectations that are strengthened by acceptance and rejection. The majority of people follow it without even realizing it. They just do so because it makes things predictable, easy, and secure. But you saw it, perhaps not all at once, but gradually. Depending on the room, people's behaviors altered. In order to prevent conflict, honesty was frequently filtered and distorted. The extent to which individualism was accepted, provided that it didn't undermine the system. Once you noticed the pattern beneath the surface, the invisible borders that everyone was cautious not to cross, you were unable to ignore it. You stopped acting in the same manner. Just because something was expected of you, you stopped saying it. When you didn't agree, you stopped acting as though you did. It wasn't dramatic or noisy. At first, it was barely noticed due to its subtlety. There are occasions when you choose truth over comfort, authenticity over approbation. However, those little moments built up and eventually made you stand out. Because it upsets the equilibrium when you cease abiding by unwritten standards, even in private. Although they may not be able to articulate it, people sense it. Something about you doesn't fit the flow they're accustomed to. You don't respond as they anticipate. You don't make the same predictable adjustments to yourself. You live just a little bit beyond the boundaries that everyone has decided not to cross. At that point, the stress begins to increase. It's not because you're doing improperly, but rather because you're not following expectations. Furthermore, even a minor difference is more noticeable than you may imagine in a system based on shared behavior. It makes people conscious of the rules they have been blindly adhering to. And that awareness is uncomfortable because those norms aren't as strong as they were thought to be, if even one individual can violate them. Additionally, all of the effort they put into following them begins to feel doubtful if they're not solid. Your decisions have an impact on more than just yourself. They subtly question the framework on which everyone else relies. As a result, people respond more immediately at times and more quietly at others. They may ask you questions and attempt to help you return to your regular state. They may offer remarks that serve as gentle reminders of how things should be, not necessarily out of malice, but rather out of a desire to reestablish the equilibrium they are accustomed to. They begin to perceive you differently when that doesn't work, and you keep moving in your own manner. As someone who is upending the system itself rather than just making different decisions, the feeling is there, even if they don't express it that way. You start acting in a way that deviates from their common perception of appropriate behavior. It's not attention-seeking revolt. Standing out just for the sake of standing out is not the goal. It's about being unable to act as though the rules make sense when they don't. It's about realizing that something genuine is sacrificed in order to fit into something manufactured, and it gets more difficult to accept that trade-off if you see it clearly. However, they perceive your refusal as disobedience. It appears that you're making the decision to deviate from something they've dedicated themselves to and centered their identity around. Because of this, your presence seems like a subtle disturbance, a warning that the framework they depend on isn't as strong as they believed. They don't react negatively to your accomplishment as you may anticipate. Compared to that, it is quieter, more subdued. Their tone slightly changes when your name is spoken, their pauses between sentences, and their refusal to focus too much on what you've become are all examples of how it manifests. Because they don't see your growth as loud or ostentatious, it's not the same. Something more difficult to overlook. You didn't simply alter your situation, you transformed yourself. It's uncomfortable because of that. In theory, anyone can pursue results. However, changing into a different person, someone who is more self-aware, disciplined, and in charge of their own path, is a different type of transformation. It is not something that happens by chance or without effort. Even if they don't express it, they are aware of it. And that's where the tension starts, because each step you take forward subtly mirrors the steps they didn't take. Every development you've made, every habit you've formed, and every instance in which you prioritized growth over comfort all serve as quiet comparisons. Even if it's not one you made, they still feel it. People want to think they're doing their best, that they're making the correct decisions, and that their current situation is justified. It keeps them at ease, relieves them of the burden of what they could have done differently. But because you didn't have any secret edge, they are compelled to doubt that assumption when they encounter you, even if only briefly. You didn't begin in a totally different place. You were similar to them in many respects, so your advancement cannot be written off as chance or luck. It suggests something different. They understand the need of effort, discipline, and consistency, but they haven't fully committed to them. It's difficult to accept that realization. It causes a sort of internal strife. They may appreciate what you've done on the one hand, however, it also makes people conscious of their own hesitancy, passivity, and propensity to prioritize comfort over change, and that discomfort is frequently diverted rather than confronted head-on. Occasionally, it becomes silent criticism. They minimize your accomplishments, downplay your progress, and search for weaknesses in what you've created. Not because those imperfections define you, but rather because acknowledging them lessens the threat to your development. They won't have to question their own decisions as much if they can persuade themselves that your accomplishment isn't as significant as it appears. In other cases, it manifests as distance. They retreat because being near you reminds them of something they're trying to avoid, not because you've done anything wrong. The distance between where they are and where they may be is continuously reflected by your presence, which functions as a kind of mirror. And not everyone is prepared to confront that reflection. In actuality, your development did not make them uncomfortable. It made it clear. It revealed something that had been there all along, something they had been able to ignore as long as nothing changed. However, you evolved. By doing this, you upset their reliance on a sentient. It has nothing to do with competing with you. It concerns what you stand for. Change, possibility, and the notion that things don't have to remain the same. Even though that concept can be motivating, it can also be unsettling, particularly for someone who isn't prepared to take action. Therefore, they perceive your growth as pressure, an unspoken challenge they didn't ask for, a reminder of potential they haven't utilized, rather than something to learn from and be inspired by. And if you don't deal with that pressure, it gradually becomes more intense, heavier, and easier to focus on you than on yourself. Resonances.